"You look like you need some company." 5 words. That's all she said. And Wyatt Callahan, a man who hadn't let anyone touch his heart in 5 years, felt something crack open inside his chest, like old timber giving way in a winter storm. He wanted to tell her to leave. He wanted to say he was fine. He wanted to be the man everyone in Red Hollow believed he was: cold, unreachable, carved from stone. Instead, his hands stopped moving. And for the first time in years, Wyatt Callahan said absolutely nothing. If this story speaks to your heart, subscribe to our channel and follow Wyatt's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from, because I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning Wyatt Callahan broke 3 fence posts with his bare hands wasn't the morning anyone in Red Hollow remembered. They remembered the time he pulled old Hector Briggs out of a ditch in January without saying a word. They remembered the time he sat with a dying mare for 16 hours straight, refusing to leave until the animal passed peacefully. They remembered the quiet, methodical way he moved through the world, like a man who had decided the world owed him nothing and he owed the world even less. But nobody saw the fence posts. Nobody saw him drive his fist into the first one until his knuckles split and bled. Nobody saw him grab the second with both hands and wrench it sideways until the wood cracked and groaned like something alive. Nobody saw him stand over the ruins of the third one chest, heaving, staring down at broken lumber, the way another man might stare at a grave. Nobody saw it because Wyatt Callahan had spent 5 years making absolutely certain nobody saw anything. The date had crept up on him, the way it always did, not like a storm. You can see rolling in across the mountains, but like a cold that settles into your bones before you even realize you're sick. He'd woken that morning knowing something was wrong without knowing what. He'd made his coffee the same way he always made it: black, 2 cups, nothing else. He'd pulled on his work boots. He'd walked out to the fence line. And then his hands had done what his mouth never would. He'd let himself feel it for exactly 12 minutes. Then he picked up the broken boards, stacked them neatly beside the barn, and went back to work. That was how Wyatt Callahan grieved. Quietly, violently, alone. His name in Red Hollow was both reputation and warning. If you needed a horse trained, you called Wyatt. If you needed a difficult animal gentled, you called Wyatt. If you needed someone who understood the particular language that existed between a frightened creature and a steady human hand, you called Wyatt, because there wasn't a man in 3 counties who did it better. But if you tried to make conversation at the feed store, Wyatt would suddenly find something fascinating to study on the middle distance. If you tried to invite him to supper, he'd already have his hat on and his back turned before you finished the sentence. If you made the mistake of asking how he was doing, really doing, not the polite social version, he'd look at you with those gray eyes of his, like you'd just asked him to explain color to a blind man. Cold people said. Arrogant others said. Broken said the ones who paid attention. The ones who paid attention were right, but they never said it to his face. Margaret Tilson, who ran the post office and had lived in Red Hollow since before most buildings had foundations, was the only person who ever came close. She'd said it to her daughter once quietly, when she thought no one else was listening. "That man is carrying something too heavy for one person. Has been for years. I just hope somebody comes along strong enough to help him put it down before it crushes him completely." Her daughter had nodded and changed the subject. Nobody in Red Hollow wanted to be the one to try. The house told the truth that Wyatt wouldn't. 3 bedrooms when he only needed 1. A kitchen table with 4 chairs when he ate standing at the counter. A porch swing that hadn't moved in 5 years. A garden that had been cleared and then left bare, all the work done to prepare it, none of the work done to grow anything. There was a rocking chair beside the front window. Wyatt hadn't sat in it since the winter 5 years ago. It faced the road, which was how she'd always positioned it. She used to say she liked watching the world go by, even when the world going by was nothing more than old Earl Patterson walking his arthritic dog down the unpaved street. He'd thought about moving the chair dozens of times. He never did. On the fireplace mantel, there was a photograph. Wyatt and a woman with dark hair and a laugh that you could hear in the stillness of a room, even from a photograph. Her name had been Rosalie. She'd been 29 years old when the ice took her on the mountain road outside town. She'd been driving back from Billings, where she'd gone to buy fabric for the quilt she was making. The quilt she never finished was still folded in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Wyatt had tried once to take the photograph down. He'd gotten as far as lifting it off the mantel before something in his chest seized up so completely he couldn't breathe. He'd stood there in the middle of his living room, holding that photograph until his hands stopped shaking. Then he'd put it back, exactly where it was. He left it there not because he was stuck. He left it there because he was afraid that moving it meant moving on. And moving on felt like the worst possible betrayal of a woman who no longer had the ability to move anywhere at all. Sheriff Dan Pruitt was the closest thing Wyatt had to a friend, which mostly meant they had coffee together twice a week and talked about everything except the things that actually mattered. Dan was 62, wide through the shoulders, and had a face that looked like it had been used for something practical rather than something decorative. He'd known Wyatt since they were both young and stupid, and he had the particular wisdom that comes from knowing someone long enough to understand what their silences mean. It was Dan who told Wyatt about Clara Whitmore arriving in Red Hollow. They were sitting in the diner on a Tuesday second week of April. Coffee going cold between them, the way it always did when neither man was paying attention to it. Dan had this look on his face, the careful sideways look he wore when he wanted to say something he wasn't sure would land well. "New person moving into the old Mercer building on 2nd Street, Dan said. "Opening some kind of shop. Repairs and alterations from what I hear." Wyatt didn't look up from the table. "Good for them. Young woman. Came all the way from Colorado. Seems like she's been through some things herself." "That's most people." "Wyatt." "Dan." A pause. The kind of pause that had words in it. "I'm just saying," Dan said carefully. "It might be nice if the first face she sees in this town is a friendly one." Wyatt looked up at that. He had the expression of a man who has just been asked to do something both reasonable and completely impossible. "You're looking at the wrong man. I'm looking at the only man I know who used to be decent company before he decided to stop trying." "I haven't stopped trying. I've just recognized my limits." "Your limits," Dan said, "are smaller than you've made them." Wyatt put $3 on the table for the coffee, stood up, and put his hat on. "I'll see you Thursday," he said. Dan watched him walk out and shook his head slowly. "One of these days," he said to nobody in particular, "that man is going to get tired of his own company." The waitress, a woman named Patty, who'd heard more of Wyatt's story than she ever asked for, poured herself a fresh cup and said, "Lord, I hope so. He's exhausting to watch." Wyatt did not go out of his way to avoid Clara Whitmore. He was careful about that particular point of honesty with himself. He did not cross the street when he saw her coming. He did not time his errands around her schedule. He did not ask anybody about her refuse any information about her, or take any active steps to prevent their eventual collision. He simply did not seek her out. That was different. That was his right. That was just a man making reasonable choices about how he spent his time and energy. He held that position for exactly 11 days. On the 12th day, he needed thread. It sounds absurd. A man like Wyatt Callahan, who could mend a saddle and rebuild a fence post and gentle a horse that had kicked 3 other trainers, senseless, needing something as small as thread. But he'd been repairing the binding on his grandfather's old work journal, a thing of cracked leather and faded ink that he kept more out of obligation than sentiment, and he'd run through the last of his heavy-duty black thread the night before. He could have driven to the feed store in Marbury 40 minutes away. He could have done without the repair for another week. Instead, at 9:47 on a Thursday morning, Wyatt Callahan walked into Clara Whitmore's shop on 2nd Street. The bell above the door announced him. She was behind the counter, bent over something, her blonde hair pulled back from her face, her hands moving with the practiced confidence of someone who'd learned their work so thoroughly it had become instinct. She didn't look up immediately, didn't startle, didn't scramble, didn't give him the deferential, slightly nervous attention that most people in Red Hollow offered him. She just finished what she was doing, set it down carefully, then looked up. "Morning," she said, like he was a regular, like he'd been coming in every Thursday for years. "Morning," he said, which was approximately 4 syllables more than he usually offered to strangers. "I need heavy-duty black thread, upholstery weight if you have it." She looked at him for a moment, not the way people usually looked at Wyatt, which was with a kind of cautious assessment, like they were calculating safe distances. She looked at him the way someone looks when they're actually curious, like she was reading something and found it interesting rather than alarming. "I have it," she said. "How much 1 spool should do?" She found it without having to search, which meant she knew her inventory. Wyatt noticed that because he noticed competence in people, the way other men noticed attractive faces. It registered, filed itself, refused to be ignored. She set it on the counter. $1.50. He put the money down, picked up the spool. There should have been nothing else. That was the transaction. Beginning and end, clean and simple, the way Wyatt preferred all human interactions to be. But as he turned to leave, she said, "That's a good weight for leather work. Binding something or stitching." He stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. There was a pause, the length of a breath, the length of a decision, and then he turned. "Binding," he said. "Old journal." "The wax the thread as you go," she said. "Beeswax if you have it, or a plain candle will do. Keeps it from wearing through the leather as fast." He looked at her. "I know. I figured you might," she said. Not unkindly, not defensively, just simply like she was stating a fact rather than defending a position. "I say it to everyone who buys that weight. Old habit from my mother." Something about that, the casualness, the lack of performance, the way she'd offered the information, and then immediately given him an exit from any social obligation to respond, caught him somewhere between his ribcage and his spine. "Thank you," he said. "Come back if you need more," she said, and was already looking back down at her work. He walked out. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the April sunshine, the spool of thread in his hand, feeling the strange and uncomfortable sensation of a man who has just been treated like an ordinary human being and isn't entirely sure how to absorb it. Then he put the thread in his pocket and walked back to his truck. I thought about the interaction more than he should have. Not in the way a man thinks about a woman he's attracted to, not yet, not consciously, not in any form he was willing to acknowledge. But in the way a man thinks about something that doesn't quite fit the pattern he's built around himself. A splinter. An irregularity. Something that catches without announcing itself. The wax the thread thing bothered him. Not the advice itself, which was correct and practical, but the way she'd given it, not to impress him, not to establish her credentials, not to fill silence with the kind of performed helpfulness that most people used as currency. She'd said it like it was simply useful and therefore worth saying, and then she'd let it go. Wyatt Callahan, in his 35 years of living, had met perhaps a dozen people who communicated that way. His grandfather had been one. A horse trainer in Wyoming named Old James Becker had been another. Rosalie had been one of them. He didn't let himself finish that thought. I went back 12 days later. Not for thread. He had plenty of thread. He went back because he needed a button replaced on his good wool coat, the one he wore to the rare occasions that required something better than denim, and he could have sewn it himself, but the button had come from an unusual set, and he'd lost the spare, and he needed it matched. And that was a reasonable errand, a practical errand, a completely defensible errand that had nothing whatsoever to do with anything else. Clara looked up when the bell rang. This time the smallest thing crossed her face, not quite a smile, but the precursor to one, like the light changing before dawn. "Back," she said. "Button," he said, and held out the coat. She took it, turned it over, found the gap where the button was missing. She had a box, a large, worn, beautiful wooden box filled with hundreds of buttons, organized in a way that only made sense to someone who'd spent years developing their own system. She went through it without hesitation, held up 2 candidates. "This one's closer," she said, holding the left. "This one's a better match for the weight of the wool." The right. "The weight," he said. "A button that's too light for heavy wool sits wrong, pulls, looks cheap even if it isn't." She held the right one against the coat. "This one." He looked at the button. He looked at her. "Fine." "Give me 20 minutes, she said. He should have said he'd come back later. He should have gone to the feed store or the hardware place or anywhere else and returned when it was done. Instead, he stood in the middle of her shop for 5 seconds, looked around at the carefully organized space, the work tables, the organized spools, the old sewing machine that had to be 40 years old, but clearly worked because she clearly used it, and then, in a decision he did not fully understand and chose not to examine. He sat down in the chair beside the door. Clara glanced up once, said nothing, went back to work. They sat in silence for 20 minutes. It was the first time in 5 years that Wyatt Callahan had sat in a room with another person and not felt the pressing, urgent need to leave. He didn't examine that either. He picked up his coat when she was done, checked the button set perfectly matched, as well as anything could be matched, and paid her without argument. At the door he paused. "Good work," he said. It was not effusive. It was not charming. It was, by most social standards, the bare minimum acknowledgement a person could offer. But Clara looked up from her box of buttons, and this time the smile made it all the way to completion, and it was the kind of smile that didn't need anything from him in return. "Same time next month," she said. He didn't answer. He walked out. But his step was for 1 block, and then 2, and then 3, something close to light. The thing about Wyatt Callahan was that he'd told himself a particular story for 5 years, and he'd told it so consistently and so completely that he'd stopped being able to hear the story for what it was, which was a story rather than a truth. The story was this: he was not someone who could love again. He was not someone who deserved to try. He had loved Rosalie, and she had died, and the love and the grief had fused themselves into a single thing inside him that he was no longer capable of separating. Moving forward meant abandoning her. Being happy meant forgetting her. Letting someone new in meant saying that what he'd had before wasn't enough to sustain him, and that felt in his chest like a verdict against a woman who was no longer there to defend herself. It was not a logical story. It was, however, a very human one. And human stories don't require logic to sustain themselves. They only require enough repetition and enough pain to calcify into something you mistake for bone. The problem, the first crack in the calcification, was that Clara Whitmore didn't push. Every person who'd tried to reach Wyatt in 5 years had pushed even when they thought they were being gentle. They'd leaned in when he leaned back. They'd offered things he hadn't asked for. They'd asked questions that were really small shovels digging at the edges of his privacy in the name of concern. They'd wanted something from him, his recovery, his openness, his healing, because it made them feel useful, or because they were genuinely kind, or because watching a person suffer creates its own particular pressure to intervene. Clara didn't push. She simply existed in her shop on 2nd Street doing her work and making good coffee, and occasionally saying things that were practical and precise and offered without expectation. And she treated Wyatt like a man who was capable of making his own choices, which was in the entire 5-year history of Red Hollow's relationship with Wyatt Callahan. An approach that exactly 0 other people had tried. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything that was his curse and his gift, the thing that made him extraordinary with horses and excruciating with people. He couldn't stop noticing. He noticed that she sometimes worked past dark, and that the light in her shop window was the last one on 2nd Street to go out. He noticed that she nodded to everyone, but didn't stop to talk to everyone, which meant she had the same instinct he did. She was careful with her energy, careful about who she spent it on. He noticed that old Mrs. Patterson, who was 78 and difficult on her best days, came out of Clara's shop one afternoon, with her coat re-hemmed and a look on her face that Wyatt hadn't seen on Mrs. Patterson in probably a decade, which was the look of a woman who'd been treated with genuine care rather than impatient courtesy. He noticed that Clara never talked about where she'd been before Red Hollow. Not in the way people notice an absence, not because she was secretive or evasive, but simply because she seemed to have made the same calculation Wyatt had, that the past was the past and the present was what you had to work with, and what was the use in dragging one into the other. He respected that profoundly, more than he wanted to. The coffee started on a Wednesday in May. Wyatt was working at the fence line nearest the road, the one he could see from where he worked, which was the honest explanation He wasn't giving himself, and Clara walked by on her way into town. She was carrying 2 cups. One she was drinking from. The other she held out toward him as she reached the fence without breaking stride, without making a production of it. "Made too much," she said. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. She was already 3 steps past him. He took the cup. "Thank you," he called after her. "Don't mention it," she called back, still walking. He stood at that fence for a long moment, holding a cup of coffee that was exactly the right temperature and made exactly the way he made his own black no ceremony, and felt the splinter in his chest work itself a millimeter deeper. The next Wednesday, she walked by again. Same time. 2 cups. One held out without breaking stride. I took it without saying anything. She kept walking. That became Wednesday. 3 weeks in, he started watching for her at that time. He didn't acknowledge to himself that he was watching for her. He simply found himself at approximately the same hour each week, working on that particular section of fence, regardless of what else needed doing. Efficiency, he told himself. Consistency. Nothing more complicated than that. The bread appeared in the 4th week of May. He found it on the fence post nearest his gate, not at his door, not in any position that would have required her to come onto the property, just balanced on the top of the post, in a cloth wrapping with a small knot in the top. Fresh bread still warm from the morning's baking. No note. He stood there staring at it for a full minute. Then he picked it up, went inside, and ate 3/4 of it standing at the kitchen counter. It was the best bread he'd eaten in 5 years. Which was either a testament to her baking, or an indictment of what his life had become, and he wasn't quite ready to examine which. He left the cloth washed and folded on the fence post the next morning. The following week, there was more bread. He left the cloth again. They developed a rhythm, a careful, wordless, entirely deniable exchange that both of them understood, and neither acknowledged, because acknowledging it would require putting words to something that was surviving precisely because no words had been put to it. Dan Pruitt noticed all of this because Dan Pruitt had spent 40 years being paid to notice things and had developed the habit past the point of professional necessity. "You've been less terrible lately," Dan said one Thursday morning over coffee. "Thank you for noticing," Wyatt said without expression. "I hear you've been talking to Clara Whitmore." A pause. Wyatt turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She sells thread. She makes bread too, apparently." Another pause. Longer. "People talk too much in this town." "People in this town have had precious little to talk about regarding you for 5 years, Dan said. "Let them have a moment." He looked at Wyatt directly. "She's good people, Wyatt." "I know." The admission surprised both of them. Wyatt said it without thinking, which meant it was true, without trying to be. Dan let it sit. He was wise enough not to push it further. But later, walking back to his truck, Dan allowed himself a small private smile. Because he'd known Wyatt Callahan for 30 years, and he'd been paying careful attention for 5 of them, and what he'd just seen in that coffee shop, a man who said something real without meaning to, was the first genuine evidence he'd had that something inside Wyatt Callahan was still alive. And alive meant there was still something that could grow if the conditions were right. Dan thought Clara Whitmore might be exactly the right condition. He didn't say any of that to Wyatt, but he bought 2 coffees instead of 1 on his way back to the station, and he left the second one on Wyatt's fence post on his way through. Because sometimes a man needs to know that more than one person in the world is paying attention. The night everything shifted happened because of a horse. Wyatt should have expected it. Horses had always been the thing that cracked him open. The language he spoke most fluently, the place where his walls were thinnest because he'd never thought to build them there. It was a mare, a gray 3-year-old named Cinder, that he'd been working with for 2 weeks. She'd come to him half wild from a property outside Marbury, a horse that had been mishandled enough to become unreachable, that shied from human hands. The way something does when it's been burned enough times to stop distinguishing between fire and warmth. He'd been patient with her. He was always patient. And she'd been coming around slowly, the way trust always comes, not in dramatic moments, but in accumulations of small ones. She'd let him closer. She'd stopped dancing away from his hand. She'd even once pressed her nose against his shoulder in that soft, deliberate way that horses use when they've decided to trust. That night she was sick. He knew before he opened the barn. Something in the quality of the silence, something in the air. He found her in the corner, shaking, sweating her eyes, going in that terrible way that told him she was in pain and frightened and beyond the reach of the language he'd spent weeks building with her. He got on the phone to Doc Reardon, got the medications, did what needed to be done, and then he stayed. He settled into the straw beside her, his back against the wall, and he stayed. At some point, past midnight, he didn't know exactly when he heard footsteps on the gravel outside. Then the barn door opened, and Clara Whitmore stepped in. She had a lantern and a thermos, and the expression of a woman who has made a quiet decision. He stared at her. "I saw your light still on," she said, simply, like it was explanation enough. "You should go home," he said. She looked at Cinder. She looked at Wyatt sitting in the straw. She set the thermos down near his hand. "I probably should," she agreed. And then she sat down on the other side of the barn door, her back against the wall, her lantern between them, and said nothing else. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through him. Not anger, not confusion, not the reflex of pushing away. Something older than all of those things. Something that had been locked in the cedar chest at the foot of his bed for 5 years. "She's going to be all right," he said finally about the horse. "I figured," Clara said, "you were here." She said it like it was a fact about the world, like gravity, like weather. Like a man like Wyatt being there was simply what it meant for things to be all right. He didn't know what to do with that. So he unscrewed the thermos and poured coffee into the lid and said nothing. They sat together through the rest of the night, the lantern between them. Cinder breathing steadier as the hours passed, the silence doing what all good silences do, holding two people together without requiring them to explain why. At some point, just before dawn, Wyatt looked across the lantern at Clara, who had fallen asleep against the wall, her head tipped to one side, her hands loose in her lap. He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Cinder, who had settled completely and was breathing in the long, slow rhythm of an animal that had decided finally that it was safe enough to rest. Something in his chest moved. He didn't reach toward it. But for the first time in 5 years, he didn't push it away. He sat with it in the dark, like a man learning to hold something fragile, without either gripping too hard or letting it fall, and he watched the sky outside the barn door begin very slowly to go gray. And somewhere in that gray morning, Wyatt Callahan, the loneliest cowboy in Red Hollow, Montana, the man who had decided that loneliness was easier than loss, recognized, with a clarity that frightened him completely, that he was in serious trouble. Because Clara Whitmore had found the one crack in every wall he'd ever built. She'd found it without looking. And the worst part, the part that kept him in that straw until full morning came, was that somewhere in the part of himself he'd locked away with the cedar chest and the rocking chair and the photograph on the fireplace mantel. He wasn't sure anymore that he wanted her to stop. Clara left before Wyatt was fully awake. He'd drifted somewhere between sleep and waking. In the last hour before sunrise, his back stiff against the barn wall, the thermos cold beside him, and when he opened his eyes fully, she was simply gone. The lantern was out. The barn door was pulled shut behind her. If not for the empty thermos and the faint impression in the straw across from him, he might have convinced himself the whole night had been something he'd dreamed. He didn't convince himself of that. He tried briefly and failed completely. Cinder was standing. That was the first thing he checked. The first thing he always checked. And the mare was on her feet, shaky, but present, her eyes clear and her breathing even. He checked her temperature, ran his hands down her legs, watched how she shifted her weight. She was going to be fine. He'd known that somewhere around 3 in the morning when her breathing smoothed out and she stopped shaking. But knowing and seeing were different things, and he stood there with his hand on her neck for a long moment, letting the relief settle. Then he picked up the thermos, walked back to the house, and stood in his kitchen for 20 minutes without making coffee, or eating or doing anything except standing there thinking about a woman who had walked into a barn at midnight without being asked, and sat against the wall without being invited, and stayed until dawn, without saying a single word that required anything from him. He was in trouble. He'd admitted that to himself in the dark hours, and daylight hadn't changed it. The question he poured into the bottom of the coffee cup he finally made himself fix was what he intended to do about it. The answer he arrived at by the second cup was nothing. He was going to do nothing about it because doing something about it required believing he was capable of something, and he had spent 5 years building a very precise and carefully maintained argument for why he was not. I was going to continue accepting the Wednesday coffee and leaving the cloth on the fence post and occasionally buying thread he didn't need, and he was not going to examine any of it more closely than that. And eventually, whatever this was, would settle back into the comfortable distance he'd maintained with every other person in his life. That was the plan. It lasted 4 days. On the 5th day, he was in town picking up grain when he heard it, a voice raised just past the point of politeness, coming from the direction of Clara's shop. He wasn't going that way. He had no reason to go that way. He was parked on the opposite side of the feed store, and his truck was loaded, and there was no logical reason for him to cross the street. He crossed the street. There were 2 of them men he recognized from the Hargrove property out on Route 9 ranch hands who passed through Red Hollow on paydays, and generally left the town somewhat worse than they'd found it. The larger one, a man named Cord, who had the particular look of someone who'd been told he was funny his whole life, and had taken that to mean he was entitled to an audience, was leaning against Clara's doorframe, with an expression on his face that Wyatt disliked immediately. "Come on now," Cord was saying, his voice carrying that studied drawl that men put on when they want to sound harmless while being the opposite. "We're just being friendly. You moved to a new town, you ought to meet the locals." Clara was in the doorway, not retreating, not frightened exactly, but holding herself with the careful stillness of someone who has calculated their options and found them limited. "I've met the locals," she said. "I'm working right now." "Shop's slow," the other one said. He was shorter, darker, with the kind of laugh that meant he was enjoying himself. "We can see through the window." "I'm working," Clara repeated. Flat. Final. The tone of a woman who has said this kind of thing before and has learned that the tone matters more than the words. "Maybe we could come in and keep you company," Cord said. "Nice day. Nothing better to do." Wyatt stepped up behind them. He didn't say anything immediately. He just stopped close enough that the physical reality of him registered 6 feet of man who spent his days doing physical labor and had the particular quality of stillness that comes from knowing with certainty that you don't need to perform a threat to make one. Cord felt it before he saw it. He turned and the grin on his face went through 3 phases in about 2 seconds, surprised, assessing, recalculating. "Callahan," he said. Cautious now. The practiced friendliness dropped somewhere around his boots. "You need something from this shop," Wyatt said. A pause. "Just talking." "She said she's working." Wyatt's voice was exactly the same as it always was, even quiet, unhurried, which was worse somehow than if he'd been loud. "Which means you're done talking." Cord looked at him for a moment, looked at Clara, looked back at Wyatt. Made the calculation that men like Cord always eventually made in the presence of men like Wyatt. "No trouble," Cord said, and pushed off the doorframe. They walked away, not fast enough to look like running, but moving steadily in the direction of away. Wyatt stood there until they turned the corner. Then he turned to Clara. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Not grateful, or not just grateful. Something more complicated. "I had it," she said. "I know," he said. "I've handled worse." "I know that too." A pause. She studied him. "Then why'd you come over?" He looked at her. It was a good question. It was in fact an excellent question, and he didn't have an answer for it that he was willing to say out loud, so he said the true but incomplete version. "I was across the street." Clara looked at him for a long second. Then something in her face relaxed, not into relief, but into a kind of quiet recognition, like a woman who has seen this particular kind of deflection before and has decided for reasons of her own to let it go. "You want coffee," she said. He should have said no. "Yes," he said. That was the first time Wyatt Callahan went inside Clara Whitmore's shop for any reason other than commerce. He stayed for 40 minutes. They talked about horses, about the grain prices, about the road repairs that had been promised on Route 9 for 3 years and remained unpromised in every other sense of the word. They talked about practical things. They talked the way two people talk when they're both aware there are other things they could be talking about and have both silently agreed that the practical things are safer. But at one point, entirely without intention, Wyatt said something real. He'd been talking about a colt. He was working with a difficult one, a young horse with too much fear and too much energy and not enough trust in anything human, and he was explaining the approach he used, the particular patience required, and he said, "You can't rush a frightened thing. It doesn't matter how good your intentions are. All it knows is that you're pushing, and anything that pushes is a threat. You just have to be there, consistent, long enough that it stops waiting for you to hurt it." He said it about the horse. Clara looked at him over her coffee cup. She didn't say anything, but her eyes said that she understood it was not entirely about the horse. Wyatt hurt himself and felt the heat rise in the back of his neck. He left shortly after. He drove home faster than necessary and spent the rest of the afternoon in the barn with Cinder, who had the decency to want nothing from him except grain and the occasional reassurance of his hand. He didn't sleep well that night. He lay in his bed in the dark and stared at the ceiling and understood with the particular clarity that comes at 2 in the morning when there's no distraction left to hide behind that something was happening to him. Something he had not given permission for. Something that had found the small crack in the barn the night he sat beside a sick horse in the dark, and had been quietly, patiently making that crack wider ever since. And the part of him that had spent 5 years being Wyatt Callahan, the man who needed nothing and wanted nothing, and had locked the door from the inside, that part was terrified. The other part, the part he'd buried, the part that had loved Rosalie and dreamed about children running in the yard and growing old with someone beside him. That part was something he didn't have a word for yet. He lay there between those two parts of himself until the alarm went off at 5, and then he got up and did what he always did. He worked. But that morning working, he found himself listening for the sound of footsteps on the road. At 10:30, he heard them. He did not look up from the fence post. A cup appeared on the flat top of the post beside his hands. Black coffee, right temperature. "Made too much," Clara said, already 3 steps past. "You always make too much," he said without looking up. She paused. He felt the pause before he heard it, a tiny break in the rhythm of her steps. Then she laughed. Just briefly, just once, the kind of laugh that comes out before you decide whether to let it small and genuine and warm. She kept walking. He stood there with both hands on the fence post and the coffee beside him and something moving in his chest, like a thing that has been very still for a very long time and is remembering slowly how to move. He did not examine it. He picked up the coffee, drank it, and went back to work. But he was almost smiling. And the almost was the largest space it had been in 5 years. It was Dan who broke first. Which was in the entire history of Dan and Wyatt's friendship entirely consistent with pattern. They were on their Thursday morning coffee 2 weeks after the barn night, and Dan put his cup down with the deliberateness of a man who has been rehearsing something. "I'm going to say something," Dan said, "and I need you to let me finish before you put your hat on." Wyatt looked at him. "I'm not wearing my hat." "You're always wearing your hat, just sometimes it's metaphorical." Dan folded his hands on the table. "You like her." "I buy thread from her." "Wyatt." "And she makes good coffee." "Wyatt, look at me." Wyatt looked at him. Dan had known that face for 30 years, and he had never seen what he saw in it now, which was the face of a man fighting himself on 2 fronts simultaneously. "I know," Wyatt said finally. Quietly. Exactly 2 words, but they landed like something much larger. Dan let out a breath. "Okay. It doesn't matter." "Why not?" "You know why not." "I know the reason you've been telling yourself for 5 years, Dan said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing as why not." Wyatt was quiet. Outside, someone drove past with a radio playing something country, something he didn't recognize. The sound of it moved through the diner and left. "She was going to Billings to buy fabric," Wyatt said. His voice was level the way a man makes his voice level when the alternative is something he's not willing to do in a public diner. "For a quilt. She told me on a Thursday morning and she was going to be back by dinner. I fixed a fence that afternoon. I made chili. I set 2 bowls out. He stopped, started again. I didn't hear the car. I heard the knock. Dan said nothing. This was one of the things Wyatt valued about him. He didn't fill silences with comfort that the moment didn't earn. She was 29, Wyatt said. She was going to buy fabric. I know, Dan said. How do you do that? Wyatt asked. Not angry, not rhetorical, genuinely asking. How do you decide it's worth it again, knowing what you know now? Dan was quiet for a moment. He turned his cup in his hands. I don't think you decide, he said finally. I think you just notice one day that it already happened, and then you decide what to do about it. Wyatt looked at him. That's not helpful. No, Dan agreed. But it's true. The bell over the diner door rang as someone came in. Neither of them looked up. She lost her family too, Dan said after a while. Before she came here, I don't know the details, she doesn't talk about it. But she came to Red Hollow with a sewing machine and a box of buttons and started over from nothing. That takes a particular kind of person. Wyatt turned his cup in his hands. I know what kind of person she is. I know you do. Another silence. This one different, not empty, but full of everything neither of them was going to say. I don't know how to start over, Wyatt said. And this was the thing he'd never said to anyone. The real admission, the one underneath all the other admissions. Not that he missed Rosalie, which was obvious. Not that he was lonely, which was evident. But this, that he didn't know how. That the mechanism for beginning again had rusted completely in 5 years of disuse, and he wasn't sure anymore if it could be made to work. Dan looked at him for a long moment. I don't think Clara's asking you to start over, he said. I think she's asking you to just keep going. There's a difference. Wyatt sat with that. Then he put $3 on the table, stood up, and put his hat on the real one, not the metaphorical one. I'll see you Thursday, he said. Dan watched him leave. He flagged down Patty for a coffee refill. He was smiling, but he hid it politely because some moments are too fragile to celebrate out loud. The thing that happened next. Wyatt didn't plan. He was walking back to his truck past Clara's shop on 2nd Street, because it was on the way, because the street was a through street, because there was no meaningful choice involved, and he saw her in the window. She was working her head, bent her hands, doing something at the table. The afternoon light came through the window, and she didn't know he could see her. He stopped. He stood on the sidewalk outside her shop, and he watched her work for almost a full minute. And in that minute, he felt the entire argument he'd been making against himself for 5 years. All its perfectly constructed logic, all its careful scaffolding, all its well-maintained certainty, that he was not a man capable of this. He felt it sway, like a fence post hit hard at the base, still standing, but not as steady as it had been. Then Clara looked up. She saw him through the glass. I didn't have time to look away. He'd been standing there too long. She had seen him see her. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then she tilted her head slightly the way she did that particular angle that meant she was deciding something, and she held up the coffee thermos she kept on her work table. A question. Simple as that. He could have walked on. He had all the social permission in the world to simply nod and keep walking, to reclaim the distance with a gesture and a step. His hand moved before his mind caught up with it. He pointed at the door. He was inside 30 seconds later. I didn't plan to stop, he said immediately, which was exactly the wrong thing to say, and he knew it while saying it. Clara was pouring the second coffee. Okay, she said. I was walking past. I know. I could see you walking past. She handed him the cup. Then you stopped. He looked at the cup. Yes. That's allowed, Wyatt. It was the first time she'd used his name without it being attached to a transaction. No, here's your change, Wyatt, or good to see you, Wyatt. Just his name alone at the end of a sentence, in a voice that was neither careful nor careless. Just his name the way it actually sounded when someone was speaking directly to another person rather than performing speaking. Something in him answered it, not out loud, but answered. Thank you, he said. For the coffee, but not only for the coffee. She looked at him. She had a way of looking, not evaluating, not seeking, but simply present fully attentive the way horses were when they'd decided you were safe, that he found almost unbearable in its directness. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Every muscle in him braced. "You can ask." "The rocking chair," she said. "The one in your front window. I've walked past your place for 2 months. I've never seen anyone in it." He stared at her. "You noticed that. I notice things." Not apologetically, just as fact. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she started to say something, started to take the question back. He could tell because she'd seen something shift in his face, and he said before she could, "It was hers, the woman I lost." His voice was steady. He was proud of that irrationally. "She used to sit in it evenings, watch the road." He stopped. Then, because he'd started, "I've never moved it." Clara was very still. "I've walked past it," she said, quietly. "More than 2 months' worth of evenings." A pause. It looked like it was waiting. He looked up at her. "Chairs can't wait," he said. "No," she agreed. "But people can." The words landed somewhere in the center of him and sat there. He turned the cup in his hands. He made himself breathe. "Clara," he said. And then he stopped. Because what came next required him to be a different man than he'd been for 5 years, and he wasn't sure he was that man yet. She waited. She didn't prompt him. She just waited the way she'd waited in the barn, the way she'd waited every Wednesday morning at the fence line, the way she waited in every interaction she'd ever had with him, with the specific patience of a person who understands that some things cannot be rushed and have decided that the waiting is worth it. "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "Do what?" "This." The word was insufficient, and he knew it. He gestured barely just a small movement of his hand, and somehow it encompassed the coffee and the shop and the barn night and the bread on the fence post and the way she'd said his name and everything else that had been accumulating for 2 months in the space between a man who'd shut himself down and a woman who'd refused to notice. Clara looked at him. Something moved in her face, tender and precise, and entirely without pity, which was the version of tenderness he could actually receive. "You're doing it right now," she said. He looked at her. He looked at her for a long time. And then Wyatt Callahan, who hadn't done anything truly frightening in 5 years, said, "Maybe you could come out to the ranch, some evening. I'll make dinner, if you want." Each sentence short, each one costing him something. The last 3 words, the smallest and most expensive. Clara picked up her own coffee. The smallest smile crossed her face, the full one, the complete one, the one that didn't need anything from him in return. "Okay," she said. "Just that. Okay." He left the shop 5 minutes later. He walked back to his truck. He sat in the driver's seat and put both hands on the wheel and stared at the windshield. His heart was hammering. It was the most terrifying he had felt in 5 years. It was also, and this was the part he wouldn't say to anyone, that he barely allowed himself to think the most alive. He started the truck. He drove home. The ranch looked different somehow pulling up the drive. Same fence, same barn, same house, same rocking chair visible through the front window, same. But something was different. Something in how he saw it. Like the very first adjustment of light after a long dark, not bright, yet not resolved, but changed. Unmistakably changed. He sat in the truck for a moment. Then he went inside, stood in the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and took a genuine inventory for the first time in longer than he could remember. Not what he needed to survive, but what he might cook. For 2. What he might make that was worth eating across a table from another person. In the living room, the rocking chair sat beside the window. He didn't move it, but he looked at it differently. He looked at it like a man who has finally understood that the things we keep from the people we loved are not betrayals of the living. They are simply proof that we knew how to love. And maybe the thought arrived carefully with both hands, like something that might bolt if he grabbed it. Maybe knowing how to love even imperfectly, even with scars, even with a grief that would never fully dissolve, was still the same as being someone who could do it again. Maybe. I was not certain. He was not ready to be certain. But for the first time in 5 years, he was not certain he was wrong. He went to the barn to check on Cinder, who pressed her nose against his shoulder in that deliberate, trusting way she'd recently learned. He stood there in the quiet and let her. And in the last light of the afternoon, for the first time in a very long time, Wyatt Callahan did not feel entirely alone. He spent 3 days preparing for a dinner he told himself wasn't a big deal. That was the first lie. The second was that he cooked for himself all the time, and this was no different. The third, and this was the one that cost him the most to maintain, was that inviting Clara to the ranch meant nothing beyond two people sharing a meal the way neighbors did in small towns, the way ordinary people did, without turning it into something significant. He burned the first attempt at bread on Tuesday. He hadn't baked bread in 5 years, hadn't seen the point, and his hands remembered the motions, but his attention kept sliding sideways, and the loaf came out of the oven, black on the bottom and raw in the middle, and he stood over the sink holding it for a moment before throwing it away with more force than the situation required. He drove to the store and bought bread. Then he drove back and stood in the kitchen and decided that was not acceptable, and drove back and bought the ingredients to try again. The second loaf came out right. He stood in the kitchen and looked at it cooling on the counter. A good loaf. A proper loaf. The kind of thing you put on a table when someone is coming. He hadn't put anything on a table in 5 years. He stood there looking at that loaf of bread for probably 3 minutes longer than any bread has ever warranted. And then he went and found his good tablecloth in the back of the linen cabinet and shook it out and put it on the table. And then he stood back and looked at the table with a tablecloth on it and felt simultaneously ridiculous and more purposeful than he'd felt in a very long time. Clara came on Friday evening exactly when she said she would, because of course she did, because that was the kind of person she was, the kind who set a time and meant it. He heard the crunch of gravel before he heard the knock, which was good, because it gave him approximately 4 seconds to relocate himself from the window, where he'd been standing, to the kitchen, where he was ostensibly doing something useful. She knocked twice. He counted to 3 before opening the door because he had some dignity left. She was carrying a jar of something. Honey he saw from the Kellerman farm out on Route 7. She held it out when he opened the door. "I heard you made bread," she said. He looked at the honey, looked at her. "From who?" "Patty at the diner. She said you bought flour twice in 1 week, which is apparently notable." "This town," he said. "This town." She agreed with something in her voice that wasn't quite mockery, but was in the same family. He stepped back from the door to let her in. This was the moment he'd been both anticipating and dreading for 3 days. The moment she stepped into his space. The space he'd preserved exactly as it was for 5 years. The space that still had the rocking chair, and the photograph, and the cedar chest, and all the careful architecture of a grief he'd never let anyone close enough to witness. He'd thought about it. He'd walked through the house the morning before with fresh eyes, trying to see it the way she would, trying to calculate what she would notice and what it would tell her about him. What he hadn't accounted for was that she wouldn't make him feel observed. She stepped in, looked around briefly, the way anyone does in a new space, and then her eyes went to the fireplace, to the photograph, and she looked at it for just a moment, and then she looked back at him and said, "Something smells good." That was it. That was all she did. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Beef stew," he said, "and bread." "The second loaf or the first?" He stopped moving, turned to look at her. "Patty told you about the bread. Who told you about the loaves?" Clara had the expression of a woman exercising elaborate innocence. "I have no idea what you're talking about." Dan, he said. "I genuinely could not say." "I'm going to have a conversation with Dan Pruitt." "You have that conversation every Thursday already," she said. "It doesn't seem to slow him down." He looked at her. She looked back. And then something happened that hadn't happened to Wyatt Callahan in 5 years, that he'd honestly stopped believing was something his body still knew how to do. He laughed. Not the polite version, not the controlled exhale that passes for laughter among men who've forgotten the real thing. An actual laugh, short, surprised, real. It moved through him like something physical and left a warmth behind it that scared him a little. Clara's face did something quiet and pleased. He turned back to the stove before she could see what his face was doing. They ate at the table with the good tablecloth, and she spread the honey on the bread without asking permission, and he found he didn't mind. They talked the way they'd been learning to talk practically at first, then less practically. The conversation moving the way it does when two careful people allow themselves to stop being quite so careful. She told him she'd grown up on a property in Colorado. Her father had been a farrier, worked with horses. She knew the smell of a barn from childhood. That explained something he'd been wondering about without admitting he was wondering about it. She said her family was gone now, said it simply the way people say the things they've made peace with, or the things they've chosen not to let unmake them. She didn't elaborate. He didn't push. "Why Red Hollow?" he asked. She considered it. "I had a map," she said. "I was serious. I spread it on the kitchen table of the last place I lived, and I just put my finger down." He stared at her. "That's not true." "The map part isn't," she admitted. "But the randomness part is. I drove north until I felt like stopping. Red Hollow felt like it could hold weight." She paused. "Some places feel light, like they'd let things blow through without holding on to them. Red Hollow felt like it holds on." He thought about that. "It does," he said. "Sometimes that's not comfortable." "No," she said. "But comfortable and safe aren't always the same thing." He was quiet. Then, "No, they're not." They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through. Inside, the stove ticked as it cooled. The lamp on the counter made the room warm and specific, the kind of warm that has nothing to do with temperature. "The photograph on this mantel," Clara said, quietly, carefully. Not a question, not pushing, just an opening. He looked at his hands. "Rosalie." "She was beautiful." "Yes." A pause. "You don't have to tell me about her. I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then, because she'd given him the choice, and the choice made it possible. She was the kind of person who made rooms feel different when she was in them. Not loud about it. Just the air changed. He stopped. "I spent about 2 years after she died being angry at every room that felt the same as it always had. Like the world didn't know the difference." Another stop. "Eventually you stop being angry at rooms." Clara was looking at him with that full attention that asked nothing. "I kept everything," he said. "The chair, the photograph, the quilt she was making. I told myself I was honoring her, keeping the things she touched." He exhaled. "Somewhere along the way I stopped being able to tell the difference between honoring her and just being afraid." The sentence landed between them. He felt it land. He hadn't said that to anyone, hadn't said it to Dan, hadn't said it to himself with that particular precision. It had formed itself out of the dinner and the lamplight and the specific quality of being with a person who made truth feel less dangerous than it usually was. Clara reached across the table and put her hand over his. Not for long, just briefly, the weight of it there, and then gone the way you press a hand to a wound to remind the body to close itself. "Thank you for telling me," she said. He looked at where her hand had been. "I made a pie," he said, because he had absolutely nothing else he knew how to do with that moment. She burst out laughing, real full surprised, and the sound of it in his kitchen was so sudden and so right that he felt it in his sternum like a physical thing. He brought the pie. It was not a good pie. He'd made it from canned apples because he hadn't thought about fresh ones in time, and the crust was too thick on one side and too thin on the other. And when he cut it, it fell apart in a way that he suspected good pies were not supposed to do. He set the plate in front of her. "It's bad," he said preemptively. She looked at it. "It looks brave," she said. He sat down. "That might be the most generous description of a failed pie I've ever heard." She ate it anyway. The whole piece. She did not pretend it was good. She had the decency not to do that. But she ate it with the particular attitude of a person who understands that the effort behind a thing and the quality of the thing are two separate categories, and both deserve acknowledgement. After dinner, she helped clear the table. He washed and she dried, and that somehow was the most domestic and most terrifying 11 minutes of the entire evening. The two of them moving around his kitchen together, her knowing where the dish rack was without asking him, handing plates across without having to think about it. The ordinary machinery of two people in a shared space, running so naturally, it felt like a version of something they'd done before. I was very careful not to examine it. She left before 9, told him she had early work in the morning. He walked her to the gate, not to the car, just to the gate, which maintained some version of the distance he was still telling himself he needed. She stopped at the gate and turned to look at him. "This was good," she said. Simple as everything she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Looked at him in that direct, uncomplicated, fully present way of hers. "You seem surprised," she said. He thought about denying it. "Maybe a little." "Don't be," she said. "You're better company than you think you are." Then she walked to her car and drove away down the unpaved road. Her taillights disappearing around the turn, and Wyatt stood at his gate in the evening air and felt the world rearranging itself around him in ways he could not stop and was no longer entirely sure he wanted to. He went inside. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the table, the good tablecloth, the plates that had held two people's dinner, the pie dish that had held the world's most honest dessert. He left it all out. Didn't clear it that night. Went to bed. Lay in the dark. This time he didn't stare at the ceiling. He was asleep inside 10 minutes, the deepest sleep he'd managed in longer than he could calculate. And if he dreamed, he didn't remember the dreams in the morning, and the not remembering felt for the first time in 5 years, like rest rather than loss. Then the anniversary came. He'd lost track of it, which was the first warning sign, and the one he least recognized. He'd lost track because he'd been busy, genuinely busy. Not the performed busyness of a man filling time, but actual busyness. The kind that comes from a life with enough in it to occupy attention. He'd been working the horses, he'd been having dinner with Clara twice a week for 3 weeks. He'd been talking to Dan with something approaching actual candor. Or he'd been doing the thing he'd stopped believing he was capable of, which was simply living in the present moment. Rather weeks. He'd been talking to Dan with something approaching actual candor. Or he'd been doing the thing he'd stopped believing he was capable of, which was simply living in the present moment, rather than dragging the past behind him like a chain. So the date arrived without the usual advance warning. He woke up and knew. The way you know a storm before you can see it. Something atmospheric. Something in the quality of the silence. Something his body remembered, even when his mind had almost moved past it. June 14th. Rosalie had been dead for 5 years and 3 days exactly because she'd died on June 11th, and he always felt the weight start building on the 12th and crest somewhere on the 14th, when the reality of the permanence of it hit him freshest. He had no logic for why the 14th and not the 11th grief had its own internal calendar that bore no relationship to the actual dates. He got up, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, the same table with the same chairs that had held two people's dinner 3 nights ago, and sat with the grief the way he always had. Quietly. Alone. Letting it move through him the way weather moves, because he'd learned in 5 years that the only way past it was through it. He was okay. How was genuinely okay, which was itself a new kind of ache, because there was a version of him that had believed for 5 years that he wasn't supposed to be okay. That okay meant forgetting that okay was the first step toward betrayal. He sat with that contradiction for a while. How was still sitting with it at 9:30 when Clara's car came down his road. He heard the gravel, looked up. She wasn't due. They didn't have a plan. It wasn't a Wednesday. There was no reason she should be here. He went to the door before she knocked. She stopped when she saw him. Read his face immediately. He could see her doing it. Her eyes making the small adjustments that meant she was understanding something. "Wrong day," she said. "No," he said. "You can—" He stepped back from the door. She came in. She didn't ask what was wrong. She didn't offer anything she hadn't been asked for. She went to the kitchen, found the coffee pot, poured herself a cup, and sat down across from him at the table. Sat in the same chair she'd sat in 3 nights ago. "Anniversary," he said. "Okay," she said. 5 years. "Okay." He looked at her. "You're not going to say anything." "What do you want me to say?" He thought about it. "Nothing," he admitted. "I don't want you to say anything." "Okay," she said, and drank her coffee. They sat there for 40 minutes. The morning moved around them. He talked sometimes pieces of Rosalie. He found himself wanting Clara to know, not in the formal way he'd managed at dinner, but in the ragged, non-linear way of actual grief, The way you tell stories about someone when the loss is real and not performed. He told her about Rosalie's laugh, which was too loud for the size of her. He told her about the quilt, the colors Rosalie had chosen, blue and yellow, which had seemed optimistic to him at the time, and devastating every time he opened the cedar chest. He told her about the fabric errand, and the Billings drive, and the ice on the mountain road, and the knock on the door. Clara didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't make it smaller or more manageable or easier than it was. When he ran out of words, she said, "She sounds like someone who knew how to be in a room." "Yes," he said. "That's exactly right." "I would have liked her," Clara said. And that not the condolences, not the comfort, not any of the things people usually offered, that was what finally cracked him. Not all the way, not in any outward visible way, but somewhere in the deepest, oldest, most carefully guarded part of his chest, something gave. He put his elbows on the table and his face in his hands. I didn't cry. He was not in this story a man who cries easily. But he sat there with his face in his hands for probably 30 seconds. Breathing, just breathing, letting the weight of 5 years press through him without fighting it. Clara put her hand on the table near his. Not touching, just there. He lowered his hands, looked at her hand near his, looked at her face. "I don't know what I'm doing," he said. "You're grieving," she said. "You're allowed to do that, and also live your life. Those aren't opposites." "I know that," he said. "Logically." "Logically," she repeated gently. "The rest of me hasn't always agreed." "The rest of you is coming around," she said. "I've been watching." He looked at her. "Have you?" "Hard to miss." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "You laughed the other night. Real laugh. I don't think you noticed." "I noticed." "Did it feel like a betrayal?" The question was so precise, so exactly the question he'd been asking himself without being able to form it, that it stopped his breath for a second. "Yes," he said. "For about 4 seconds. And then it just felt like laughing." Clara nodded slowly. "That's what forward looks like," she said. "Not some big dramatic change. Just 4 seconds of guilt, and then the thing that comes after." I was quiet. He turned his cup in his hands, the same gesture she'd watched him make for months now. "You're good at this," he said. "At what?" "At not making things harder than they are." She smiled at that, not the full one, but the quiet kind, the one that came when something landed true. "I had a lot of practice being around grief," she said. "When my family," she stopped. "Then, it teaches you to sit still. Most people panic in someone else's pain and try to fix it. There's nothing to fix. You just have to be present for it." He looked at her. Something he'd wanted to know for months now presented itself. "What happened with your family?" The quiet between them changed texture. She set her cup down, looked at her hands. "My mother got sick when I was 19, she said. It was 3 years before she died. My father, he couldn't hold it. The grief, the caretaking, the staying. He left when she had about 6 months left." A pause. Not dramatic, just honest. "She died in May. I was 22. I sold the property, took what I could carry, and drove." She looked up. "Red Hollow wasn't the first place I stopped. It was the first place that felt like it could hold me." He looked at her. This woman who had driven alone into grief and kept moving. Who had watched a parent abandon the hardest moment and chosen in the aftermath to become someone who stayed. Who had walked into a barn at midnight and sat against the wall until dawn without being asked. "I'm sorry," he said. "Thank you," she said. And then, with a small, clear-eyed look that was one of the most adult things he'd ever witnessed. "I'm not sorry it happened. I was for a long time. But it made me the person who can sit here and not panic while you feel what you're feeling. It made me patient." She met his eyes. "I am very patient, Wyatt." She said his name again, the same way. Just his name. The warmth that moved through him was not appropriate for a man sitting at a table on his worst day of the year, and he recognized it, and for the first time, he did not immediately try to shut it down. He let it be there. He sat with it the way he'd learned to sit with Cinder in the barn, present, still giving it room to decide whether he was safe. Then something shifted. He looked at the photograph on the mantel from where he sat. He could see Rosalie's face from the table, that dark hair that caught mid-laugh expression. He looked at it a long time. Then he looked at Clara, and the fear that moved through him was sudden and total and specific. Not the old fear, not the grief fear, but a new one. The fear of a man who has realized with the full force of realization that he is in love with the woman sitting across his kitchen table on the worst day of his year. Who has realized it not as a possibility or a tendency, but as a fact, complete and accomplished, something that had been true for longer than he'd been willing to admit. He loved her. He loved the way she gave advice about thread without expectation. He loved the bread on the fence post without a note. He loved that she'd eaten his terrible pie without pretending it was good. He loved that she'd come today without being called and sat without being asked and gave him Rosalie back instead of trying to replace her. He loved her. And the love terrified him so completely that he stood up from the table with the abruptness of a man who has touched something electric. "I need to check on the horses," he said. Clara looked up at him, read his face again. Her own face did something complicated, understanding and hurt, crossing each other too fast to separate them. "Okay," she said. He went to the barn. He stood with Cinder and breathed and pressed his forehead against the mare's neck and felt the animal's warmth and steadiness, and thought about every way he was about to destroy the best thing that had happened to him in 5 years. I thought about the cattle drive North Hendricks outfit was going out in 2 weeks, needed experienced hands, long stretch out through the high country. He'd turned them down months ago. He could call. Distance. Distance was what he'd always used. Distance was reliable. Distance didn't die on a mountain road in December. Clara was still at the table when he came back inside. She looked at him, and she knew. He could see she knew. She was too perceptive, and she knew him too well by now. This woman who noticed which fence post he worked near on Wednesdays, who saw the rocking chair and understood it without being told, who looked at his face and read it the way he read horses. "You're going to run," she said. He looked at her. He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said, and her voice was very quiet and very steady, and it cost her something. He could hear it costing her. "Don't tell me you're not. I can see it." He stood in the middle of his kitchen, 5 years of defenses standing at the ready, and he looked at the woman who had walked back into his life without invitation, and his love and his fear were so completely braided together he couldn't find the end of either one. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be sorry," she said. "Just don't go." He stood there. He stood there for a very long time. And then, God help him, he made the wrong choice. "I need some time," he said. Clara stood up. She picked up her cup, brought it to the sink, washed it out the way she always did, dried it and set it in the rack. She turned around and looked at him with eyes that were clear and not accusing, and somehow that was the worst version of how this could go. "Okay," she said. She walked past him. At the door she stopped. "The thing about time." "Wyatt," she said, her back to him, her hand on the doorframe, "is that it doesn't fix the fear. It just passes." She looked back over her shoulder. "Don't confuse the two." Then she walked out. He stood in his kitchen and listened to the gravel under her tires as she backed out and drove away. Then he went to the phone and called Roy Hendricks. "You still need a hand on that drive," he said. "2 weeks out," Roy said. "Long run." "I know," Wyatt said. "I'll be there." He hung up the phone. He stood in the kitchen in the silence she'd left behind with the 2 coffee cups in the rack where she'd put them, both her and his side by side. He stood there until his chest stopped seizing. Then he went to pack. He left before dawn on a Tuesday, which was not a Wednesday, which meant there was no coffee on the fence post to avoid. He told himself that was coincidence. He packed light bedroll work clothes, the things a man needs when he's going to spend weeks doing hard physical work in open country. He did not pack the photograph from the mantel. He did not take the wooden horse he'd been carving from a piece of walnut he'd found in the barn, the small figure he'd been shaping in the evenings without admitting to himself who it was intended for. He left it half-finished on the workbench next to his grandfather's journal with the repaired binding and the upholstery weight thread that had started everything. He left a note for Dan. 3 sentences. told him where he was going, approximately how long, and asked him to keep an eye on Cinder. He did not write Clara's name anywhere in the note. He did not write her name because writing it would have required acknowledging that she was the reason he was leaving, and if he acknowledged that, he would have had to acknowledge what that said about him, and he was not yet prepared to have that conversation with himself at 4:30 in the morning with a packed bag and a phone call already made. He drove to the Hendricks staging point in the dark and didn't look in his rearview mirror once. That was also something he told himself was coincidence. Roy Hendricks was a man of 60, with a face like cured leather and the particular patience of someone who has spent 40 years managing cattle and only slightly fewer years managing the men who manage cattle, which requires an entirely different and considerably more complicated skill set. He looked Wyatt over when he arrived, looked at the bag, looked at the truck, looked at Wyatt's face, the way men like Roy look at faces, not for what's there, but for what's being held back. "Thought you turned this one down," Roy said. "Changed my mind," Wyatt said. "Something running you or something pulling you." It was too early in the morning and too close to the bone, and Wyatt gave Roy the look that had been making people in Red Hollow change subjects for 5 years. "Does it matter?" Roy shrugged. "Matters on a long drive. Man running from something gets tired halfway through and wants to turn back. Man running toward something keeps his head down." He handed Wyatt a coffee from the thermos he was holding. "I'd like to know which I'm dealing with." Wyatt took the coffee. "I'm working," he said. "That's all you need." Roy looked at him for another moment, then nodded once. "Fair enough. We push out in an hour." Wyatt took his coffee and went to check the horses, and tried not to think about the fact that even Roy Hendricks, who barely knew him, had seen it in his face inside 30 seconds. The first week on the drive was what he needed it to be: hard, physical, consuming. The kind of work that fills every hour from before sunrise to well past dark, and leaves a man too tired to think about anything more complicated than where to put his bedroll. The days had a rhythm: early, long hours in the saddle, cattle management equipment checks, brief meals, collapse into sleep that was as close to pure as any life Wyatt had ever lived. No history in it, no future in it, just the work and the miles and the flat repeating logic of moving a herd from one point to another. How was good at it? He was good at most things he applied himself to, and he applied himself to this completely, because complete application was the only version of himself he knew how to offer. The other hands noticed quickly that Wyatt Callahan was not a man who wanted conversation, which was both accurate and, in the context of a cattle drive, somewhat unusual. Most drives had a social quality: long hours in open country, the enforced proximity of shared camps, the natural human tendency to fill silence with words when there's nowhere to go and nothing else to do. Most drives produced stories and complaints and arguments, and the particular bonds that form between men when they're tired and far from comfortable. Wyatt listened. Occasionally he responded. Mostly he worked, and when the work was done for the day, he sat apart from the group at the edge of whatever light the campfire was throwing, and looked out at the dark, which was very dark this far from town, and completely perfectly silent. He thought about Clara. He had told himself he would not. But that was the kind of promise a man makes to himself when he believes he has more control over his own mind than he actually does. She came to him at the end of every day, when the work stopped being enough to crowd her out. Her face in the barn doorway with the lantern. Her hand near his on the table on June 14th. The way she'd stood at his door and said, "Don't go," with a steadiness that had cost her something visible. I thought about what she'd said at the door. The thing about time, Wyatt, is that it doesn't fix the fear. It just passes. He turned that sentence over every night, the way he turned the coffee cup in his hands. Because she was right. He knew she was right, and that was the worst part. He'd left knowing she was right and gone anyway, which made this not a retreat into wisdom, but a retreat into fear. He knew the difference. He'd always known the difference. He'd just been too frightened to stop pretending he didn't. 8 days into the drive, they hit the mountain stretch. This was the part Roy had warned them about before they set out the section through high country where the road narrowed and the weather turned unpredictable, and a herd of cattle became considerably less manageable than it was on flat ground. Wyatt had done mountain driving before. He knew the specific challenges of keeping animals calm when the terrain changed and the temperature dropped and everything familiar became unfamiliar. What he didn't expect was the sound of motorcycles. He heard them before he saw them. The low thunder of engines coming up the mountain road from the opposite direction, growing steadily louder, arriving at the curve in the road at approximately the same moment that the lead cattle decided the sound was something to be afraid of. The herd bunched and shifted, two of the younger steers beginning to break away, the whole leading edge of the drive threatening to scatter in a direction that had nothing on its other side but a very steep and very unforgiving drop. Wyatt moved without thinking. He had his horse turned and positioned before his mind had fully processed what was happening. Body acting on 20 years of instinct, cutting off the breaking steers, pushing them back toward the herd, using his horse and his voice, and the particular combination of presence and pressure that was his gift with animals. He got them contained. The motorcycles stopped. There were 7 of them. Big road bikes, the kind built for long distance, ridden by men who clearly had experience stopping in tight spaces without causing more chaos than they found. The riders cut their engines almost simultaneously, which was the right call and the experienced call. And Wyatt registered that before he registered anything else. He looked at them over the heads of the cattle he was still holding in position. The leader, the man at the front of the group who had pulled up closest and whose bike was now silent and still was big. 60 or so, gray at the temples, wearing the cut of a Hells Angels chapter, with the particular ease of a man who had earned everything on it over many years. He had the face of someone who had made peace with most things and was in no hurry about the rest. He looked at the herd. He looked at Wyatt. He held up both hands briefly. Easy, no trouble. And then he called across. You need help holding them. It was not the question Wyatt expected. I've got it, Wyatt called back. Give me 2 minutes. Take 3, the man said. And then to the riders behind him said something Wyatt couldn't hear, and all 7 of them climbed off their bikes and stood in a line on the edge of the road, arms loose at their sides, making themselves part of the boundary rather than part of the problem. It took Wyatt 2.5 minutes to settle the herd. When he turned his horse back toward the road, the riders were still standing where they'd been patient and still doing exactly what they'd offered to do. Wyatt looked at the leader. Thank you. Good handling, the man said. He had a voice like gravel over hardwood, worn smooth in places, rough in others. You've done mountain work before. Some. Where you headed? North, long drive. The man nodded. Then he said, You want coffee? We've got a camp about a mile up. Could use a flat stretch to let the engines cool anyway. Wyatt looked back at Roy, who had come up behind the herd and was close enough to have heard. Roy raised one eyebrow in a question. Wyatt looked at the riders, then back at Roy. An hour? Roy said. We could all use a rest. The camp up the road was ordered and efficient. The kind of camp that comes from people who travel hard and have learned to make any stop work for them. There was coffee on within minutes, food being passed around without ceremony, the casual competence of a group that had been moving together long enough to have their systems down. The leader's name was Marcus. He didn't offer a last name, and Wyatt didn't ask for one. He'd been riding with his chapter for 35 years. Not the criminal mythology that the name conjured in most people's minds, but the actual reality of men who had built a brotherhood around long roads and loyalty, and the specific code of people who showed up when showing up was hard. They sat with their coffee on the rocks above the road, the herd settling below them, the mountain quiet around them. Long way from a town, Marcus said. That's the point, Wyatt said. Marcus looked at him. Not assessing, just looking. Running or thinking. It was the second time in 8 days someone had asked him that question, and the precision of it repeated landed differently this time. Everybody asks me that, he said. Because it shows, Marcus said, simply, without apology. Wyatt looked at his coffee. Thinking, he said, because he was tired of lying about it. About a woman. He looked up. You got a sign on me. The corner of Marcus's mouth moved. Men who do long drives to think about nothing look different. Men thinking about a woman look the way you look. He drank his coffee. Been that way my whole life, not subtle. Wyatt was quiet. Around them, the other riders and the ranch hands had found their own conversations. The two groups mixing with the easy pragmatism of people who have done a hard thing together and don't need more reason than that to be civil. "She told me something," Wyatt said. He wasn't sure why he was saying it to this man, except that Marcus was a stranger who would ride away and take whatever Wyatt said with him, and sometimes that's exactly who you can talk to. "Before I left, she said time doesn't fix fear, it just passes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "She's right," he said. "I know. And you left anyway." "Yes." Marcus looked out at the mountain. "I did that once," he said. "Woman in Spokane. I was 30, thought I needed to get my head right before I could be worth anything to her." He paused. "By the time I got my head right, she'd moved to Portland and married a dentist." Wyatt looked at him. "I'm not saying that to scare you," Marcus said. "I'm saying it because I spent 15 years being angry about that, and about 10 of those years being angry at the wrong person." A pause. "Wasn't her fault I left. Wasn't the dentist's fault he stayed." He turned his coffee cup in his hands, the same gesture, the same motion, so similar to Wyatt's own that it stopped him for a second. "Only one person's fault." The mountain was very quiet. "She's patient," Wyatt said, meaning Clara. "She told me she's very patient." "Patience runs out," Marcus said. "It's not a character flaw, it's just a fact. Patient people get tired too. They just take longer, and they're usually quieter about it when they do." He looked at Wyatt directly. "You got someone patient enough to wait on a man like you don't spend that on a cattle drive." The words hit Wyatt in the center of the chest, with the clean specific force of something true. He sat with it. He sat with it through the rest of the coffee, and through the hour of rest, and through the handshakes, when the riders mounted up and the herd started moving again. Marcus gave him a single nod from the saddle of his bike, before the engine caught. Not goodbye exactly. More like the acknowledgement men give each other when something real has passed between them that neither one will mention again, and neither one will forget. Then the bikes rolled, and the sound moved down the mountain, and Wyatt rode back to his position in the drive. That night at camp, he did not sit apart from the group. He sat at the fire with Roy and the other hands, and he let the conversation move around him, and he thought about the woman in Spokane, and the dentist in Portland, and patience that runs out quietly, and the half-finished wooden horse on his workbench at home. He thought about Clara washing the coffee cup and putting it in the rack next to his before she left. He thought about her eating the terrible pie without pretending. He thought about her voice at the door, steady and clear, and costing her something, saying, "Just don't go." He thought about what Roy had said on day one. Man running from something gets tired halfway through and wants to turn back. He was tired. How was tired in the way that had nothing to do with the miles or the work or the long days in the saddle. He was tired of the specific exhaustion of fighting himself, of building the walls and then defending them and then building them again when they cracked, of waking up in the morning and making the choice to be closed rather than letting himself be the person he actually was, which was a man who could love, and who had loved, and who was apparently, despite 5 years of evidence to the contrary, not yet done with it. How was tired of the empty thermos and the tablecloth folded back in the cabinet, and the rocking chair that nobody sat in. He was tired of being the loneliest man in Red Hollow, Montana. He went to find Roy. Roy was doing his last check of the equipment before turning in the way he did every night, and he looked up when Wyatt came over. "I need to go back," Wyatt said. Roy looked at him for a moment. "How far are we?" 8 days out. "Herd's 2 weeks from the end." "I know." He looked at Roy steadily. "I'll pay you the full rate. I'll find you a replacement hand before I leave." Roy was quiet. He set down the strap he'd been checking. He looked at Wyatt with the particular attention of a man who has been reading people for 60 years and knows when a decision is real versus when a man is posturing. "Woman," Roy said. "Yes," Wyatt said. No deflection this time, just the word plain. Roy looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the nod of a man who understands that some things outrank a cattle drive. "Parsons can take your position," Roy said. "He's been ready for more responsibility anyway." He picked the strap back up. "Get some sleep. You'll want to start early." Roy, Wyatt said. The older man looked at him. Thank you, Wyatt said. Don't thank me, Roy said. Just don't come back if you're going to leave again. It wasn't cruel. It was just the plain language of a man who valued follow-through. Wyatt received it the way it was meant. He found Parsons. He arranged the transition. He did it carefully and completely, the way he did everything, because leaving a job half done wasn't in him, even when the job was one he was leaving to fix a worse mistake. Then he went to his bedroll, and for the first time on the drive, he set his alarm for 4:30 without any dread of what the waking day would require. How was going home? He rode through most of the next day, trading off with a truck at the edge of the high country where the road became passable for vehicles, and drove the remaining distance through the afternoon and into the evening. 8 days out on horseback collapsed into hours in a pickup on open road, the miles peeling away. Red Hollow growing closer in increments he could feel in his chest before he could see them in the distance. He stopped once for gas and coffee at a station outside Marbury. While the truck filled, he stood in the cooling evening air and pulled out his phone, the thing he'd barely touched in 8 days, and looked at it. No messages from Clara. He hadn't expected any. That was not how she operated. She'd said what she had to say at the door, and she was not a person who chased or repeated herself or filled silence with noise to manage her own anxiety. He thought about calling. He put the phone back in his pocket. What he needed to say was not something he was going to say on a phone from a gas station outside Marbury. It required being there. It required looking at her. It required standing in front of another person and saying the true thing without the option of hanging up. He drove. The lights of Red Hollow appeared on the horizon just past 8 in the evening, and something in his chest unwound at the sight of them. Some knot he'd been carrying since 4:30 on a Tuesday morning when he'd driven away without looking in his rearview mirror. He felt his shoulders drop, felt his hands ease on the wheel, felt the particular relief of approaching a place that has become more than a location, approaching a place that has become, while you weren't paying full attention, something closer to home. He drove past the end of 2nd Street. The light was on in Clara's shop. He stopped the truck. He sat there with the engine running and looked at the lit window. It was past 8. She didn't usually work past 8. But the light was there, which meant she was there, which meant the conversation he'd been building in his head for the last 8 hours of driving did not have to wait until morning. He sat with that for 30 seconds. Then he turned off the engine. He walked to the door of her shop. The closed sign was turned, but there was light inside, and through the glass he could see her at the work table, the same position, the same bent head, the same hands moving with the same precise, unhurried confidence. He knocked. She looked up. He watched her face move through several things in the span of 2 seconds. Surprise, then something careful, then something she put away before he could identify it. She set down what she was working on. She stood. She crossed to the door. She unlocked it and opened it and looked at him. He looked back. How was 8 days of road and mountain and campfire away from the last time she'd seen him, and he was aware that he looked at dusty, tired, carrying the particular weight of a man who has been a long way, and not just in miles. He was also for the first time in a very long time exactly where he meant to be. "You're back," she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him steadily. Not guarded, not cold, not the version of hurt that presents as distance. Just present the way she was always present, fully and without armor. "Are you back?" she said. And the distinction, the difference between the body returning and the person arriving, was entirely clear. He met her eyes. "I'm back," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that he felt every one of those 8 days standing between them like distance that would need to be crossed deliberately, one honest step at a time. Then she stepped back from the door. "I was about to make coffee," she said. He walked in. She locked the door behind him, not dramatically, just the practical click of a bolt, and went to the back of the shop where the small table was, where the coffee things were, where they had sat. The first time he'd come in for reasons other than commerce, and stayed 40 minutes and talked about fence repair and grain prices and the particular defection of Route 9's road improvement promises. He sat in the same chair. She made the coffee without asking how he took it, because she knew. She set his cup in front of him and sat across and looked at him with those clear, patient, entirely present eyes. He put both hands on the table. "I owe you a conversation," he said. "You don't owe me anything," she said. "But I'm listening." He looked at his hands, then up at her. Then he decided for the first time in 5 years that he was not going to manage this moment. He was not going to carefully construct the version of himself that could get through it cleanly. He was going to be the actual version, imperfect, frightened, uncertain, and present. "I love you," he said. The words out loud in a lit room to another person's face after 5 years of silence were the most frightening thing he had ever done. Clara went very still. "I've known it for longer than I admitted it," he said, before she could say anything because he needed to finish. "I left because knowing it frightened me more than anything has since—" He stopped. "Since the knock on the door 5 years ago. I told myself it was for time, that I needed to think." He shook his head. "I was hiding. The way I've been hiding since I was 30 years old, and someone knocked on my door to tell me the road was icy and she was gone." He looked at her directly. "I don't want to hide anymore. I don't know how to promise you I'll be perfect at this. I know I won't be. But I'm here. I came back. And I need you to know that I know the difference between here and gone." Clara looked at him. Her eyes were bright, not crying, just bright the way eyes go when something moves through a person that's too large for the regular surface of a face to hold. She reached across the table. She put her hand over his. This time she didn't take it back. "I know the difference too," she said quietly, "between a man who can't stay and a man who comes back." Her hand tightened on his. "You came back." "Yes," he said. "Then we start there," she said. Outside read. Hollow was quiet in the way. Small towns are quiet late in the evening, deeply specifically the kind of quiet that has known people for generations and has a shape to it rather than being simply the absence of noise. Inside the shop, the coffee cooled untouched between them, and neither of them moved toward it, because some things are more important than coffee. And both of them were old enough and had been through enough to know immediately when they were inside one of those moments. Wyatt Callahan held the hand of the woman who had found the crack in every wall he'd ever built, and felt the last of the walls, not gone exactly, but no longer necessary in the way they'd been. Still standing, because some things that have held weight for a long time don't fall overnight. But unmanned, no longer actively defended. And that it turned out was enough. That was exactly enough to begin. He thought about the half-finished wooden horse on the workbench. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would finish it. He finished the wooden horse the next morning. He'd been up before for old habit. The body's clock indifferent to what the night had held, and he'd gone to the barn first, the way he always did. Checked. Cinder run his hands down her legs, let her press her nose against his shoulder in that deliberate way she'd learned meant she was safe. Then he'd gone to the workbench and picked up the half-finished figure and the small carving knife, and worked in the early quiet until the shape was complete. It was not a perfect carving. The left ear was slightly higher than the right. The tail was thicker than he'd intended. But the posture was right, head lifted, weight forward, the particular attitude of an animal that has decided to trust something. And he held it in his palm for a moment, and looked at it, and thought about a woman who had walked into his barn at midnight with a lantern and a thermos, and sat against the wall until dawn without being asked. He wrapped it in the cloth from the bread. The same cloth he'd been leaving on the fence post, washed and folded every week for months. He thought she would recognize it. He thought that recognition would say something that the carving alone couldn't. He drove to 2nd Street at 7:30, which was early for the shop to be open, but he knew she was there because the light was already on. The same way, it was almost always already on, because Clara Whitmore had come to Red Hollow with a sewing machine and a box of buttons, and she did not believe in wasting daylight. He knocked. She opened the door before the sound of it had finished. She'd slept. He could see that, but not long. There were faint shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there last night, and her hair was pulled back in the quick way rather than the careful way, and she was holding a cup of coffee with both hands like it was keeping her anchored to the morning. She looked at him. He held out the cloth-wrapped carving. She looked at it, then at him. Then she took it, set her coffee down on the counter, and unwrapped it with the careful attention she gave everything. Not slow, but unhurried, like the difference between caution and deliberateness. She looked at the wooden horse for a long time. When she looked up, her eyes were doing that thing too bright, too full. The thing they did when something moved through her too large for the ordinary surface of a face. "The cloth," she said. "Yes," he said. She understood it exactly the way he'd known she would. She set the horse on the counter, picked up her coffee, looked at him over the rim of it. "You want breakfast," she said. "I want to talk," he said. She put the cup down. "Okay." He came inside. She closed the door. They sat at the small table in the back, the same table, the same chairs. The geography of this shop already familiar to him, in the way that places become familiar when you've had important moments in them and the moments have changed you. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what comes next. And I don't have a clean answer. I want to tell you I do. I want to sit here and tell you I've worked it all out, and I know exactly how this goes." He looked at her steadily. "But I think you'd know that was performance." I would," she said. "What I know," he said, "is that I'm done making decisions based on fear. I'm done using distance as a management strategy." He paused. "I'm done choosing the version of my life that can't hurt because nothing real is in it." Clara was very still across the table. "I want you in my life," he said. "Fully. Not in the careful way I've been doing it, the bread on the fence post and the Wednesday coffee and the controlled distance that let me pretend I was fine." He shook his head. "The real version, whatever that looks like." "It looks complicated," Clara said quietly. "Yes. It looks like two people with a lot of history that isn't about each other." "Yes. It looks like slow," she said. "Like doing it right instead of fast." "I know how to be patient," he said. "With things that matter." Something shifted in her face, the last of whatever careful reserve she'd been holding since he walked back in last night, the residue of 8 days and a door, and the words just don't go. It didn't vanish all at once. It moved the way weather moves, not gone, but changed, opened. "Okay," she said, for the third time. The word that was becoming between them, a kind of vow, small and plain, and meaning everything. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers. This time, he was the one who didn't take it back. Dan Pruitt found out before noon, which was a record even by Red Hollow standards. He showed up at the ranch at 11:15 with the expression of a man who is working very hard to appear casual about something that is not casual at all. He came around the side of the barn, where Wyatt was working with a young gelding, stood at the fence rail, and looked at Wyatt with the particular brand of restrained satisfaction that only a 30-year friendship can produce. "You're back," Dan said. "Word travels," Wyatt said without stopping what he was doing. "Patty saw your truck on 2nd Street this morning." A pause. "Outside Clara's shop. Patty should consider a career in intelligence. She'd be excellent." Dan put his arms on the fence rail. "You want to tell me what happened?" "No." "Wyatt." Wyatt stopped, looked at Dan, read the face of a man who had watched him for 5 years with a patience that had never asked for more than he could give. He owed this man more than deflection. "I went," he said. "I stayed 8 days. I came back." He met Dan's eyes. "I told her." Dan was quiet for a moment. "Told her what specifically?" "All of it." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a man receiving news he had hoped for long enough that the hoping had become its own kind of weight, and the receiving of the thing hoped for is both relief and something almost like grief for all the time the hoping took. "Good," Dan said, quietly. "Just that." "Don't make it a thing," Wyatt said. "I'm not making it anything. I'm standing at your fence." A pause. "I might be smiling a little." "I noticed." "I've been waiting 5 years. I'm entitled to a small smile." Wyatt looked at him. Something in him that was warm and tired and relieved, and still a little frightened, said, "I'm going to need you to be patient with me. It's not going to be smooth. I don't know how to do this anymore. I haven't let myself want something in 5 years, and wanting something is—" He stopped. "Terrifying," Dan said. Yes. Welcome back to the human race, Dan said. We've missed you. He pushed off the fence. I'll have Patty put it in the paper. Dan, joking, mostly. He walked back toward his car. At the gate he stopped. Wyatt? He turned. She's good. She's genuinely good. You deserve someone genuinely good. Wyatt looked at the fence. I know. Make sure you act like you know, Dan said. Every day, not just today. He got in his car and drove away, and Wyatt stood at the fence and felt the weight of 30 years of friendship in 4 sentences and was grateful for every single one. The town found out within the week, which was inevitable, and which Wyatt had accepted as the price of living somewhere small and choosing to stay small. Red Hollow ran on the currency of other people's business and the business of Wyatt Callahan, who had been a closed door for 5 years and was now reportedly regularly seen having coffee at Clara Whitmore's shop and occasionally walking with her in the direction of the diner, was the richest currency the town had seen in some time. He didn't enjoy it. He tolerated it, which was different but sufficient. What surprised him was the particular quality of the reaction, not prurient, not gossipy, in the mean-spirited sense, but genuinely warm. Old Margaret Tilson from the post office stopped him on the sidewalk one morning, looked him up and down, with the assessing directness of a woman who had been watching this town for 60 years, and said, "You look like a person again." He didn't know what to do with that. "Thank you," he said. "She's a good one," Margaret said. "I watched that girl when she first came here. She didn't know anyone and she didn't ask for anything and she worked every single day. That's character. That's the real kind, not the kind people perform." She looked at him steadily. "Don't waste it." "I don't intend to," he said. "Intention," Margaret said with the air of someone who had seen intentions come and go for 6 decades, "is where you start. It's not where you end." She patted his arm once the way a woman does when she's made her point and sees no reason to belabor it, and walked back into the post office. He stood on the sidewalk and thought about that for the rest of the morning. Clara heard about Margaret and laughed the real laugh, the one that came without permission. They were having dinner at the ranch for the 4th time a Thursday this time, and she'd brought the honey again, and he'd made chili again, and the table with the good tablecloth had become in the space of 3 weeks something that felt less like occasion and more like routine, which was a word he was learning to love again after years of dreading it. "She's right, though," Clara said, still smiling. "Everybody keeps telling me not to waste it," he said, "like I'm going to forget." "People who've watched you for 5 years are allowed to be emphatic," she said. He looked at her across the table. "What about you? What are you allowed to be?" She considered it. "Honest," she said. "I'm allowed to be honest." She set her fork down, looked at him with the full attention he'd come to depend on without realizing he was depending on it. "I'm not going to pretend this is easy for me either. I've been on my own for a long time. I built a whole life around being self-sufficient because that was the only reliable option I had." A pause. "Letting someone in after that it's not just hard for the person who's been closed. It's hard for the person doing the opening, too." He looked at her. "You never looked afraid." "I was terrified," she said simply. "Every Wednesday when I made too much coffee. Every time I left bread on the fence post and didn't know if it would still be there when I came back, or if I'd come by and find it on the ground and understand that was the answer." She met his eyes. "I was frightened every single time. I just decided the frightened was worth it." He sat with that. "How did you decide?" "You were worth it," she said, like it was obvious, like it was the simplest calculation she'd ever made. He didn't have a response to that was equal to the statement. So he reached across the table, and she put her hand in his, and they sat like that for a while, the chili going warm on their plates, the evening moving around the ranch, the way evenings did, slowly with purpose, carrying the day toward its natural close. "I want to show you something," he said after a while. He stood. She stood. He led her out of the kitchen and through the living room and to the fireplace where the photograph had been for 5 years. Rosalie's face mid-laugh. Dark-haired, the image of a woman who knew how to make rooms feel different just by being in them. Clara stood beside him and looked at it. "I've been thinking about the photograph," he said. about what it means that it's there, about what it would mean to move it. She was very quiet. "I don't want to take it down," he said. "I want to tell you that clearly. I'm not going to pretend she didn't exist, or that losing her didn't make me who I am, good and bad." He looked at the photograph. "But I've been keeping it here the way a prisoner keeps the thing that proves his sentence, not as a memory, as a reason to stay locked." Clara looked at him. "I want to move it," he said, "to the study, where I can see it when I want to, where it means what it should mean, someone I loved who made me better, who I carry with me, not a guard, not a gate." He paused. "I wanted you to know before I did it. I wanted it to be a choice I told you about, not something you walked in one day and noticed was gone." Clara's eyes were doing the bright thing again. "Wyatt," she said, and her voice had a quality in it he hadn't heard before, something that was moved past the point of its usual composure. The composure he'd come to think of as architectural, as built into her, the way load-bearing walls are built into a structure. "She would have liked you," he said. He'd said it to himself privately many times in the last weeks. This was the first time he'd said it out loud. Rosalie. She had no patience for people who performed, and every patience in the world for people who were real. She would have seen you in the first 5 minutes and known exactly what you were. Clara put her hand on his arm. "Thank you," she said. "That's the kindest thing you could have told me." He took the photograph down. He held it for a moment, the same moment he'd attempted 5 years ago, and couldn't finish, the moment where his hands had seized and his chest had closed, and he'd put it back and walked away. This time his hands were steady. This time his chest was full, rather than seized full, with something that had room in it for grief and love, and the woman standing beside him, all of it at once, all of it real, none of it a betrayal of any other part. He carried the photograph to the study. He put it on the shelf above the desk, where he would see it every morning when he sat down to work the accounts and manage the ranch schedules, visible, intentional, honored in the right way, held in the right place. He stood in the study doorway and looked at it on the shelf. Clara stood beside him. "Good," she said quietly. He took a breath. "Yes," he said, going back to the living room. He stood for a moment at the window. The rocking chair was beside it, exactly where it had always been. He looked at it. Clara looked at it. The chair looked in the way inanimate objects sometimes do when they've been in a space long enough, like it was waiting for a verdict. "I'm not moving the chair," he said. "I didn't ask you to," Clara said. "I know." He looked at it. "But I'm going to sit in it. That's what I've decided." He turned to look at her. She used to sit there and watch the road. Said she liked seeing what was going by, even when it was just Earl Patterson and his dog. He looked at the chair. "I think the way to honor that is to sit in it, not leave it empty as a monument." He paused. "I've been making monuments to loss. I want to make something else." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "What do you want to make?" she said. He looked at her. At the shop owner from Colorado, who had spread her life across Red Hollow with no map and no guarantee, and nothing except the particular kind of courage that looks from the outside like patience. At the woman who made too much coffee and left bread without a note, and sat in barns at midnight and ate bad pie without pretending it was good. At the woman who had said, "Just don't go," in a voice that cost her something, and then washed his coffee cup and put it in the rack next to hers before she left. "A life," he said. "An actual one, with you in it." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he felt the weight of it, the weight of two people who have both been alone and both been afraid, and both survived things that could have finished them, standing in a living room with a rocking chair and a fireplace and a space on the mantel where a photograph had been, looking at each other and measuring honestly whether they are brave enough for what comes next. "Okay," she said, the word that was becoming their word, small and plain and true. He sat in the rocking chair. He sat in it for the first time since the winter 5 years ago, and the wood creaked under him, the way old wood does, not in complaint, but in acknowledgement, the way a house settles when it's occupied properly. He put his hands on the arms. He looked out the window at the road, the same road she had watched every evening, and felt the particular quality of the view, ordinary and specific and entirely alive. Clara sat on the edge of the low table across from him. "How does it feel?" she said. He thought about it. "Like something that was meant to be used," he said. She nodded. She understood that. He knew she understood it because she was the kind of person who understood exactly that kind of thing. The people who deal in the practical and the precise and the deeply felt. All at once, the people who give advice about waxing thread and mean something more than thread. "I have something to tell you," Clara said then. Her tone changed slightly. Not alarming, not the tone of bad news, but the tone of something important that has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. He looked at her. "I've been talking to someone," she said, "in Denver, about a larger shop, a real workshop, not just a front room on 2nd Street. She watched his face. "Someone who wants to partner on a restoration business. Old textiles, antique saddles, and tack period upholstery. The kind of work I trained for before everything." She paused. "It would mean more than 2nd Street. It would mean something I've been thinking about for a long time." I was very still. He was listening the way he listened when something important was being said, and he wanted to receive every part of it without filtering. "I turned it down 2 months ago," she said. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because I didn't want to leave Red Hollow." She held his gaze directly. "I didn't want to leave you, even when I didn't know what you were to me yet." He leaned forward in the rocking chair. "Clara, they came back last week," she said. "They want an answer by the end of the month." He looked at her. He understood what she was telling him, not just the business proposal, but everything underneath it. She had made choices around him quietly, without telling him before he had given her any reason to. She had stayed when she could have had more, because more was not in Denver. It was here. It was the bread on the fence post, and the Wednesday coffee, and the barn at midnight. She had loved him before he knew how to admit he loved her. The weight of that moved through him completely. "Tell me about the business," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. She'd expected something else he could tell. He could see her recalibrating. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Everything," he said. "Tell me what it would look like, what you'd restore, how you'd run it, what you've been thinking about since you turned it down 2 months ago." She looked at him for a moment, with an expression that was trying to understand what he was doing. He was doing something very simple. He was listening to her dream, the way she had listened to him grieve fully without agenda. Because the person across from you mattering means their whole life matters, not just the parts of it that orbit around you. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about the restoration work she'd done before her family fell apart, the training she'd had with a woman in Colorado Springs who specialized in historical textiles, the particular satisfaction of taking something broken and time-worn and returning it to exactly what it had been meant to be. She talked about saddles she could restore, that museums would want, about curtains from homestead houses that held the handwork of women 3 generations gone, about the kind of work that requires both her hands and her full attention and produces at the end something that lasts. He listened. He asked questions. Real questions, specific ones. The questions of a man who is paying attention and wants to understand. Finally, she stopped, looked at him. "You're not going to tell me not to do it," she said. Not a question. "Why would I tell you not to do it?" he said. "Because it's bigger than Red Hollow. Because the partner is in Denver. Because it would mean you have a real business," he said. "One that matches what you're capable of." He looked at her steadily. "I've watched you work. You're extraordinary at what you do. A front room on 2nd Street is not the limit of what you should be doing." She looked at him. "Red Hollow isn't Denver," he said. "But it's also not a cage. You can build something here and work larger than here at the same time. The restoration work, you could do it from here, couldn't you? Ship and receive. Go to Denver when you need to." She was quiet. "I'd looked at that," she said carefully. "But I didn't." "You didn't think it was an option because you didn't know if Red Hollow was permanent," he said. "You didn't know if I was permanent." She held his eyes. "Yes, I'm permanent," he said. The 2 words as plain and final as anything he'd ever said. No performance. No qualification. Just the fact. Clara looked at him for a long moment. The thing that moved across her face was not relief exactly. It was the larger version of relief, the version that has waited long enough to have forgotten what relief felt like, and is now recognizing it with the surprise of the unexpected. "Okay," she said, for the fourth time. He held out his hand across the space between the chair and the table. She took it. "Call them back," he said. "Say yes." "Just like that," she said. "Just like that," he said. "You've been turning down your own life for months because you were afraid you weren't staying. Now you're staying, so stop turning it down." She laughed, surprised, real, the full one, the one he loved, and the sound of it in his living room beside the fireplace, with the empty mantel and the rocking chair that was finally being sat in, was the best sound he could remember hearing in a very long time. The months that followed were not without difficulty, because nothing real is without difficulty. And Wyatt had lived long enough to know that the absence of difficulty is not the measure of anything worth measuring. There were evenings when the grief found him sideways. Not the crushing grief of the first years, but the residual kind. The grief that lives alongside ordinary life and surfaces in the unexpected moments. He'd be fixing a fence or working with Cinder, or sitting at the table with Clara after dinner, and something. A quality of light, a particular silence. The smell of something that belonged to another time would reach him, and for a moment he'd be in two places at once, the present and the past, both real, both demanding acknowledgement. He learned to let Clara see it. That was the hardest practice. Harder than the cattle drives, harder than the fence posts, harder than standing at a door and saying, "I love you," to a face that could say nothing back, harder than anything he'd taught himself about horses or grief or the management of pain. Letting her see the moments when he was in two places was the hardest thing, because it required trusting that she would not flinch, would not feel competed with, would not need him to resolve the complexity before she could be comfortable. She never flinched. She would sit quietly, or she would put her hand on his arm, or sometimes on the evenings when what he needed was not silence, but sound. She would simply start talking, telling him something about her day, or the work, or something she'd read, letting her voice fill the space until the past had been acknowledged and could step back to its proper distance. He told her once that she was the most patient person he had ever known. She had looked at him with an expression he couldn't entirely decode. "I've had a lot of practice waiting," she said. "But I want to be clear about something. I wasn't patient because I'm a patient person by nature. I was patient because you were worth waiting for." She held his eyes. "That's different. One is a virtue, the other is a choice. I chose." He'd held that for weeks. In October, 4 months after he'd sat in her shop and said, "I'm back," with his road dust and his exhaustion and his completely dismantled defenses, she moved 3 boxes into the ranch. Not moving in, not entirely, not yet, because they were both people who understood the difference between rushing and arriving, and they were not going to rush this. But 3 boxes, her sewing tools, her good lamp, a particular print she'd had on her wall in the shop, that she'd always said belonged somewhere with more light. And those 3 boxes made the ranch feel different in a way that 2 coffee cups in the dish rack and bread on the fence post had only approximated. Wyatt helped carry them in. He set the last box down in the room that had always been the room he didn't know what to do with, the 3rd bedroom, the one that had 4 chairs for a table. He ate standing at the room of the life that hadn't happened. He set the box down and looked around the room and thought, this is where the life starts to happen. He didn't say it out loud. But Clara, setting her lamp on the table, looked at him and said, "It's a good room." "Yes," he said. "It is." She plugged in the lamp, turned it on. The room with the 1 lamp and the 3 boxes, and both of them standing in it, looked like the beginning of something. The wooden horse she had placed on the windowsill of her shop the day he gave it to her. He'd noticed it every time he came, in the slightly uneven ears, the thick tail, the posture of an animal that has decided to trust. She'd never moved it. It was the first thing visible through the glass when you looked in from the street, which meant it was the first thing anyone approaching the shop would see. He'd asked her once why she'd put it there. She'd said, "So I'd see it first thing every morning, arriving at work." A pause. "And so you'd see it when you walked past. So you'd know." He'd looked at the horse in the window and understood what she was telling him. That it was a declaration, small and wooden and visible from the street. He'd been a little speechless. She'd handed him his coffee and gone back to work. Winter came to Red Hollow, the way it always did, not suddenly, but with intent. The first hard frost in early November, the kind that changes everything overnight, that makes the world look like a different version of itself when you step outside in the morning. Wyatt felt the cold and thought of ice on a mountain road, the way he always did when November came. And then he went inside and found Clara at the kitchen table, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, and her restoration work spread around her in organized sections, and she looked up and said, "I started a new saddle this morning. 1880s, I think, based on the hardware. You want to see?" "Yes," he said. And the November that had always been the beginning of his worst months became something else. Not painless, he was not pretending it was painless, but accompanied. And accompanied, he discovered, was the difference between weather you endure alone and weather you endure together, which is the same weather and a completely different experience. On a Saturday in December, Wyatt drove out to the cemetery on the hill outside Red Hollow. I went alone, which was right. He brought nothing, which was also right. No flowers, no objects, no symbols. Just himself, just the man he was now, which was a man who had been places and come back and chosen, and was choosing every day with more intention than he'd managed in 5 years. He stood at the grave. He stood there for a while without saying anything, because the years of living with grief had taught him that silence at a grave is not absence of communication. It's just a different kind. Then he said quietly to the cold December air, "I'm okay. I want you to know that." He paused. "I met someone. She's real, the real kind, like you were. She doesn't replace anything. She reminded me that I was still alive, that I was still someone who could be." He looked at the headstone. "I think you'd have seen that in her right away. You were always better at seeing people quickly than I was." He paused one more time. "I'm going to be okay. I think I already am." He drove home. Clara was in the barn when he got there, which surprised him until he saw she was sitting with Cinder, her back against the stall wall. The horse's head turned toward her in that deliberate, trusting way. Clara was not particularly talking to the horse. She was just there, present, occupying the same space in the particular way she occupied spaces, which was fully and without needing to fill it. Wyatt stood in the barn doorway and looked at the two of them. Clara looked up, took in his face. She was always taking in his face, reading it the way he read horses, with that same patient attention to what was there versus what was being held back. "Okay," she said. "Yes," he said. And he meant it in every sense of the word, the small immediate version, and the larger ongoing version, the version that reached back 5 years and forward into whatever was coming, and said yes, okay, present, alive here. He sat down beside her in the straw. Cinder pressed her nose against his shoulder. The three of them sat in the barn in the December quiet, and Wyatt Callahan, the man who had built his walls from grief and lived inside them for 5 years, felt the last of the siege lift. Not gone. Grief doesn't go, but lifted the way a siege lifts when the thing being protected is no longer threatened, when the gates can open because there's someone trustworthy on the other side. He put his arm around Clara. She leaned into him. Outside Red Hollow was doing what small towns do in December, going quiet and specific and familiar. The particular quality of a place that has held people for generations and knows how to hold them through the cold. Inside the barn, in the warmth that animals and presence make together, two people who had both been alone in ways that mattered sat together in the straw, and it was ordinary, and it was everything, and it was finally, plainly, without qualification, enough. Months later, Wyatt sat in the rocking chair on the porch as the spring came back to Red Hollow. The same chair, the same road, the same view that had once felt like a monument to absence. Clara was inside. He could hear her moving, the particular rhythm of her in his house that had become without a formal announcement. Their house, the way things become true when two people stop pretending they aren't. The wooden horse sat on the windowsill, visible through the glass. She'd brought it from the shop when she brought the 3 boxes, said. It belonged here now, said it had done its job as a declaration and could be retired to being simply what it was. A small carved thing made by someone's hands in the early morning when the world was quiet and the decision to stop running had just been made. Wyatt sat in the rocking chair and watched the road and thought about all the versions of his life that had led to this porch this morning. This particular quality of ordinary that he had once believed was not meant for him. He thought about Rosalie, who had sat in this same chair and watched this same road, and had loved the world with a fullness he had tried to honor by closing himself to it when the real honor was staying open. He thought about Marcus on the mountain turning a coffee cup in his hands. He thought about Roy, who'd said, "Don't come back if you're going to leave again." He thought about Dan and Margaret Tilson and Patty at the diner, and all the people who had watched him from a distance and kept their patience and turned out to be right. The door opened. Clara came out with 2 cups of coffee. She handed him one without breaking stride, the same motion, the same offering, the same too-much-made gesture that had started at a fence line on a Wednesday morning and had never once in all the months since felt like anything other than what it was, which was love, not performed, not managed, not carefully maintained from a safe distance. Just love, specific, daily, difficult, ordinary, extraordinary thing that 2 people build when they choose each other on enough consecutive mornings to make the choosing a fact rather than a hope. She sat beside him. He looked at the road. She looked at the road. The morning moved around them, and neither of them felt the need to fill it. Wyatt Callahan, the loneliest cowboy in Red Hollow, Montana, who had given up on love and built his walls from grief, and spent 5 years guarding an empty house from the possibility of being full. Wyatt Callahan sat on his porch in the spring morning with a cup of coffee, and the woman who had said, "You look like you need some company," and he was without reservation, without performance, without the managed distance of a man who has decided loss is the only thing that waits for him on the other side of feeling something real. He was home. Not because the grief was gone. Not because the past had been erased or replaced or resolved into something clean. But because home, he had finally learned, is not the absence of loss. Home is the presence of someone who knows your loss and stays anyway, who sits with you in the straw at midnight, who leaves bread without a note, who waits at a fence line every Wednesday with too much coffee, and the specific patience of a person who has decided quietly and completely that you are worth it. Clara reached over without looking at him and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. The rocking chair moved gently. The road lay open ahead, and for the first time in a very long time, Wyatt Callahan was not afraid